Welcome to Allegedly Doesn't Replicate, a podcast by the Institute for Replication, where we put research to the test again. In this episode, Adam tells us about the other side of research and how funding agencies see its current state. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Juan Pablo, your host. I'm joined with Abel, our co-host. And today we have Adam Salisbury, a senior researcher at GiveWell. And he's going to tell us a bit of a story of data tracking of sorts. We partnered together with GiveWell. We tried to find very hard to find data. And the results are quite surprising. But I don't want to spoil the surprise. Adam, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, guys. So I'm a researcher at GiveWell, a global health not-profit. We mostly fund programs focused on tackling child mortality in sub-Saharan Africa. So supporting immunization campaigns, vitamin supplementation campaigns, bed net distributions. I work on our research team, and we're basically responsible for taking our funds raised and finding and funding the most cost-effective giving opportunities that we can find. So that could be research or it could be programs like the ones I described. And before that, I briefly worked in the education sector. So I was a consultant at the Zanzibar Ministry of Education, and then I worked as a research economist before that as well.
Perfect. Adam, I think it begs the question, why does GiveWell or an organization like GiveWell cares about reproducing this kind of stuff? Why do you think tracking this RCTs is important, and what do you gain out of it? Like, what's the whole story behind this decision? Because at the end of the day, it's not a, I don't know, let's say it's not taking an afternoon out of this. It's putting money in the table, taking a lot of time, digging this stuff. Why does it matter? What's the take? What's your take on it?
So as a foundation, we try to make the best possible use of our resources. And in order to do that, we use cost effectiveness as an overriding principle to guide our decision making. And when we model cost effectiveness, one of the key ingredients into those models is treatment effects. So what is the effect of bed net distributions on child mortality, for example? For the vast majority of those treatment effects, we get those from the academic literature, so from clinical trials or from observational studies. We want to be really confident that we trust those results. We need to know whether something works, but also the magnitude really matters as well. Like, it matters for us whether bed nets avert 20% of child mortality or 10%, because when you're allocating resources across multiple cause areas, those shades of difference really do matter.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I have to say, I was not surprised to receive, an email from GiveWell, from yourself, and a request basically to try to see if we can reproduce and replicate as many studies as possible. And these studies are very important for GiveWell, simply because they seems to support or provide evidence that then helps you decide which, where to allocate your funding, basically. But here were my priors, and I'm curious to hear what were your priors before we started this. The second I saw the list of studies, I was like, oh boy, we're in trouble. Especially for some of them. So there's 4 big meta-literatures, and then we ended up going over all of these, listing all these studies. And some of them are randomized control trials from the 80s, sometimes these. And I was like, there's absolutely no way we're ever going to get any data in codes. And I don't say this because I don't trust research necessarily from the 80s, 90s. It's just I was thinking back of the work I was doing back in 2010 as a master's student. I have some data, but the codes, I could share it. But most people, I think, if you even go back 2005, even before that, there's really not that much data. People were just not thinking that this was something really important to store this. And where would you store this? I mean, data in the 80s, we're talking about, it's not even like on CD. People were not storing data. They didn't even think about it. They didn't have the capacity to do this. So I was a bit worried about that. But I was optimistic about research, I would say, that is a bit more recent. And I was thinking, conditional cash transfers, childhood immunization, things like this. I was thinking maybe a few. So these were my priors. And I was expecting, a high response rate, but mostly responses such as, Well, look, this is very old. I have no idea where's the data. I don't know where we stored this. And anyway, those were my priors. I'm curious, what were your priors on, and maybe your team's priors? What were you expecting out of this?
Yeah, just before I dive into those, just to give a bit of context as to why we chose those evidence bases. So what GiveWell's maybe most famous for are our top charity recommendations. So these are the programs we feel most confident in recommending, and we've directed around over $1 billion in grants over the years. So this is BedNet distributions, seasonal malaria chemo prevention, which is like preventative malaria drugs, conditional incentives for vaccination, and vitamin A supplementation as well. You're right that two of those evidence bases are very old. So BedNets and vitamin A, most of those trials were conducted in the 1980s and 90s. But two of those evidence bases, conditional cash transfers and seasonal malaria chemo prevention, they're from the noughties and tens, so a bit more recent. I think my priors were similar to yours for the very old studies. I didn't think we would be able to replicate the BedNet trials or the VAS trials, but I thought we had to ask. You never know. I was more optimistic about the later trials, so that was more of a negative update, I guess, that we just didn't get any traction there.
Something that really surprised me when you think about it is the response rate, but not in terms of people who didn't find the data, but people who didn't respond at all. You know what I mean? Because one would think, or at least I would think in my naive way to approach life, is that if someone contacts me in the, like on behalf of an organization like GiveWell, I would think that it's better to respond, right? Like chances are these people are giving away money. Chances are I could apply to a follow-up grant. Did it surprise you, Adam? Like the low response rate because of it? Because one thing is to say, oh, a rat ate my CD, you know, like that's something that happens and whatever. But to not respond at all feels kind of interesting to me. I don't know, what does it tell about science in general and this in particular?
Yeah, that did surprise me. So I wasn't surprised we weren't able to replicate these studies, but I think for 80% of the papers, we got no response whatsoever. That was more than I was expecting. Some of the people that did respond sort of offered some hypotheses as to why. I think some people may have treated this as like a spam request. Like I think people, I don't know, maybe have received similar requests before, and so just kind of get sick of them. I think some people just are on top of their inboxes, just like nothing kind of fancy about that explanation. And then the third reason is just, maybe not incentivized. So again, some people that did reply said, I could maybe look at this data, but it's not in a easily retrievable format. It would take a lot of time for me to, hire an RA or do it myself. For people in that situation, they may have been like, oh, I've got a lot of work on my plate. I just don't want to deal with another line on my to-do list.
No, that makes sense. I have a similar reading. The other thing I was thinking is, I remember at one point emailing, this is way before I started the Institute, I wanted to teach. So I was teaching a graduate class in development economics, and I wanted to just get replication packages and get my students to reproduce papers. And I emailed all the authors who had published in the journal Development Economics for a period of 6 months, so a couple of volumes. And I just didn't get any traction. People who responded knew me, and they were like, sure, it's about for your class, etc. I can shoot you something. But for the most part, people just did not respond. The response rate, though, really increased the second I started an institute. So I was more positive this time around, just because it's not a random researcher emailing you. It's the Institute for Replication. But I think the part I guess, didn't take into account too much is the fact that at that point in time, we were not reproducing anything in public health. And people in the public health and, community just didn't know the Institute too much. We're starting now actually to try to mass reproduce a couple of topics in public health. And I think in a year from now, once we have a community, people start to know the Institute in public health, then it's a different type of email. And so I think there's a bit of that. And when we talk to original authors in general, or replicators, it's like, I contacted this person, I was a student, I wanted to try to get some data and codes. No, data available upon request is usually, it's never going to happen. That's just a reality. And in many disciplines, I don't think it has anything to do with public health. I think it's sad, but it's a bit like that.
Oh, I agree. And one of the things that I wanted to ask is, this connects beautifully with an episode we had before with Elizabeth Linas and Stefano de la Viña, where they look at a whole collection of RCTs and they estimate the effect of the publishing bias, like how large the publishing bias affects the estimate. And for you, this is especially important because for academics, we just don't care in a sense. We don't have money at stake. We just want it to be published. But for you and for GiveWell, it does mean the difference between putting money in this charity and in that charity. So I wanted to ask, if you were running like the production at scale or something at a bigger scale and you wanted to fund replications or stuff like this, what does this mean? What does this mean not to be able to find the original data? What does it mean not to be able to take a second look at the stuff you want to find? Because my guess is that you want to continuously update your priors about this, right? So you cannot keep like funding research from a 30-year-old RCT because it doesn't have new data. So I wanted to ask more about the pragmatic side of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. So when we use these academic papers to inform our decision making, we don't just take the headline result at face value because exactly what you said, like we care about the truth, like the real world answer. The way we scrutinize this, I divide into two buckets. In one bucket is generalizability. So even if you did a perfectly conducted RCT in Kenya, for example, if we're funding a program in Nigeria, we need to make a call on how that result might generalize. But the other bucket, which is more relevant to your question, is we call it internal validity. So the questions we ask there are, do we think this result seems robust? Like, do they have a plausible source of randomization? Was the primary outcomes pre-registered? And yeah, one question we ask is, can we replicate the findings? And there have been cases in the past where we've done that because, to their credit, the data was publicly available. In several cases, important pieces of evidence just didn't hold up under scrutiny. So if I think about doing this on a sort of large scale, if we're not able to replicate a paper because the data or code isn't available, I think it makes me slightly less likely to take that treatment effect or whatever at face value, just given the sort of base rate we have on findings not being replicated when we have been able to do that.
It brings an interesting question because to me, many of these RCTs are really old and we don't have newer versions. People, like most researchers, would say, well, we already showed that if you give bed nets, turns out it's going to reduce malaria. Like, why do I need to do another RCT to update this? And I guess, you're answering part of this. But I also see the incentives not being there for researchers to do that. And for researchers to be like, well, it's not novel. It's been done. What are we going to do? We're just going to redo an RCT and test exactly the same thing just with new data. My answer is yes, obviously. I think we should definitely do this. Anything from the 1980s needs to be updated. The prevalence has changed. The way you communicate programs with people has changed. Everything has changed. To me, the validity of these studies is every year you just lose a bit of validity. And I think it's external, but also internal. The methods have changed. The way you do an RCT has changed. The way you do inference has changed. And when these results were published, so there was a blog post on GiveWell, got quite a lot of traction. I received lots of emails, people like asking me about this. What was the reaction at GiveWell? Or in general, just in your community? Were people thinking, oh, wow, like we're basing all these evidence, all the recommendations or some of the recommendations we're making for allocating funding and donations are actually based on studies that the data is just not available because many of these studies are old? What was the feedback? How were people thinking about this? Do you think there's any hope at all that we could actually redo RCTs like this because they're so important and maybe get some traction from like other funders and being like, let's get in the field, let's do this again, and let's spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to actually redo some of these big RCTs?
Yeah, so I think the reaction to it was mixed depending on how steep people were in the replication literature or the public health or economics literature. I think people like you had a similar priors. They were like, I'm not surprised that trials from the 80s and 90s, you weren't able to get a hold of the data. I think people that were less steeped in it were surprising because when you realize how much funding is being allocated on the basis of this evidence, so over $1 billion at GiveWell, but that's small infraction of the sort of global health community, these trials are super, super influential. And what's frustrating, if it's true that we can't replicate them, what's frustrating is there may never be another bed trial again, or a vitamin A trial, because it's not ethical to sort of withhold that treatment for people today. And so if it's true that the microdata just no longer exists, then it's just gone forever. That may sound overdramatic, but it would be hard to run another trial. In terms of whether I'm completely pessimistic about whether it's possible to replicate this, I think it's worth emphasizing that this project was quite a light touch approach. So essentially we just emailed all the corresponding authors and just asked if they'd be willing to participate in a replication effort. The fact that this doesn't work out, it doesn't make me want to throw in the towel completely. And we are at the moment considering heavier touch methods in literatures that we think could be more promising to replicate. So I think what we'll probably do now is focus on some of the later literatures like cash incentives and seasonal malaria chemo prevention, and just try other ways that we can try and incentivize engagement. This is very kind of still in the brainstorming phase, but other ways could be offering more incentives for authors. So potentially paying for RA time to dig up and put together these data sets, potentially being warm introduced to these authors rather than just sort of sending them an email. So yeah, I think it's a big deal if this data is lost, but I don't think all hope is lost. I'm still keen to keep digging.
Adam, what about the charities themselves? Do they care that the studies that they're funding are replicable in a sense? Or do you think their approach is more of, I'm doing good in the world, I'm just sending money there, I don't really care if we can do it again? Or do you think it's, because my idea as someone who works on open science, and of course I'm biased because I'm part of the institute, is if these charities who are putting down the money change the incentives, the whole incentive structure is going to change, right? So people are going to take care of their data, not only because they're going to be asked to provide it, but because chances are that their studies are going to reproduce in the future, perhaps by themselves. So my question about whether the charities care or not is more on that side. They're willing to change the incentive structure, you know?
Yeah, so I don't think all charities necessarily care about what works. I think the charities we work with them because they do care about evidence. So I think they would ultimately be interested in these questions. In terms of your question about incentives, like this project has prompted a bit of soul searching, I guess, on our part on what role we can play as a funder. So we're a consumer of research, but we're also a funder of it and are becoming increasingly more so over time. And we do have some leverage about what we can sort of demand in our grant agreements about open access. At the moment, we don't have established protocols because we've only just started funding clinical trials. But this project has been a bit of a wake-up call to us. And so we're actively considering those at the moment. And other foundations like the Gates Foundation, which has a much more sort of established history of funding trials. I know they've done a lot of interesting work in open access. So I'm speaking with some program officers there now to see if we can leverage some of their work.
That was actually my next question. Like, how did this change your view of how to fund research internally? Not only of your personal view, because of course you care about this stuff. If not, you wouldn't be investing time on it. But of your colleagues, the other people at GiveWell. Do you think this has... I don't think this is big enough to fundamentally change what they think about reproducibility, but is it piquing their curiosity about how they approach funding? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it is. So I think there's pretty reasonable consensus within GiveWell that it would be better for the world and definitely better for GiveWell's decision making if more of our research was open access and able to be replicated. And I think we all recognize that we have a role to play in that. I don't think we're the only people with a role. So I think journals have a role to play. I think institutes like Institute for Replication have a role. But I think as funders, there is some onus on us to sort of stipulate ex ante. And I think it's hard to do that ex post. Like if you've funded a RCT, but there was no stipulation up front about open publication norms, I know from speaking with someone at Gates that it can be hard to sort of retrospectively get that data out into the public. So I think, we have a responsibility to be out front on top of this.
Agree.
I guess. Juan Pablo, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to loop you in, Abel, because I think there's a lot of things at play, especially because we have limited resources. If we call this type of stuff like data detective or data sleuths, as someone on the podcast once said, like, where do you think these efforts should be focused? Like, do you think there's a specific task at hand that it's like so big that we should focus all of our energy there? Or do you think there's small pieces of stuff that we should be tackling one by one?
We're just mass reproducing a specific set of journals, recent years. That's why we end up reproducing your work. So that was like number one priority for me. And then it's way easier to communicate with the authors. There's missing data, there's missing codes. Do you want to help us? And I feel if it's recent studies, it's way easier. They're more engaged. You're not asking them something that they've done 15 years ago. The research assistant who did most of the coding and work might still be on their team. You're not asking someone at a different institution who's like, hey, you remember this project you did for me 15 years ago and now you're a prof somewhere else or outside of academia. Can you have a look? Like, it's just not happening. So that was the initial mindset. And then over time, I would say talking to Open Philanthropy, talking to GiveWell, other organizations, we're sort of changing a bit. The fundamental question is, what should you reproduce and replicate? And what Juan was saying a bit now was more the idea: should we go after specific papers we think there might be fraud, or where we question the quality of the data, or should we go after more in general questionable research practices? What seems to matter or not for an organization like GiveWell, I don't know. I don't know what matters the most. But I think the question of which papers we should reproduce is also now, for me, number one criterion would be, is it policy relevant? And I think a lot of people prefer to look at seminal papers, like highly cited. I think less and less that's important. I actually think a recent paper that is policy relevant, that just got published, should be number one on your list. It's really going to have a big impact. It can lead tons of other researchers who work on this same topic, same type of policies. So to me, like I'm shifting gears, and more I'm thinking this is the way to go. I'm less interested by older studies, just because the barriers are, well, they exist. There's not much you can do about it. I agree with you, Adam, that there's, these were just random emails. If you actually reach out to people and say, look, we deeply care, we're using your study as, to recommend a specific charity, we'd be willing to give you like $5,000-$10,000 if you can, hire someone or help us gather the data. I think you might increase, the likelihood to get some of these packages, but I don't know how many packages. So to me, if it's policy relevant and recently published, I think that's something you should deeply care about. As fast as possible, you should try to reproduce this. But I'll let Adam jump in.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, decision relevance would be the key criteria with which we'd sort of use to decide what to replicate. One way I think of this is the big if true findings would be the ones that we'd be keen to and have tried to replicate in the past. And I'll give two examples. So this is actually both, I think Open Philanthropy actually funded this, but we work very closely with them. One was a study in Africa, which looked at the impact of internet access on employment and found sort of very large effects. That's if that result is true, that's really important to people like GiveWell and Open Philanthropy, because we can potentially do something about that. We could fund internet provision in these places. And the other example is the long-run income effects of measles vaccination. So GiveWell does vaccine work already. This paper found very, very large effects on people's lifetime earnings from childhood immunization programs. If those results were true, if we took them at face value, the implication was we should devote a lot more of our resources towards our immunization portfolio. OpenPhil replicated these papers. Sorry, they paid David Rudman, who I think was affiliated with I4R at the time, to kick the tires of these papers. So rerun the regressions, found that neither were robust to alternative specifications. And yeah, that's a really big deal, because that may have prevented us from potentially entering an area that wasn't as promising as we thought. And that was part of the reason we were inspired to do this Top Charities project as well.
Yeah, that's sort of how we actually got started with Open Philanthropy. So David was at Open Philanthropy, was at I4R, but we ended up talking to David Rudman, and we actually hired someone to also do an independent replication of the same paper in Africa. What happens when you actually make it easier to have access to internet? So we did a quicker reproduction. David did a more in-depth, but it was interesting to see, the comparison, and both found some problems. And over time, OpenPhil sometimes just tells us, hey, we care about this specific study. Can you reproduce this? And then we try to find replicators. So that's how we we often collaborate with Open Philanthropy. Unfortunately, as you just mentioned, sometimes, often I would say unfortunately, the original study is not necessarily fully robust. Sometimes,
Yeah.
and it's not a yes, no. It's not this paper good or bad. Often it's way more complicated. There's going to be a 40, 50 pages report, and people often they try to consume this quickly on social media. And I'm like, no, you cannot. It's not a yes, no. There's 10 hypotheses in the original study. There's tons of things going on about the mechanism. Some of the things might be robust, some might be less so. Maybe 5 out of 10 hypotheses might be robust. Maybe the mechanisms are not, but the main tests that the authors have done. What do you do with this? And I think what I love about GiveWell, an organization like GiveWell, is it actually gives you indication of how much weight should we put on this specific study. And then you can think of, okay, that study seems to find huge effects. Internal validity we used to give that study maybe an 8. Now there's new evidence. Maybe it goes down to a 6. And then there's also the external validity you talked about. To me, that's the way you need to consume science. The idea that there's an original study being published and all of a sudden it's like, well, it must be true. It's like, no, wait, this thing needs to be reproduced at least once. And I would say often if it's a paper that is worth it and is policy relevant. And then you need to have some Bayesian, I guess, priors, or the way you update your priors, or anyway, you can update your priors the way you want. I don't really care, but everybody does it differently. But to me, these are small pieces of evidence. And then at the end, you're building something, a foundation. And anyway, that's the way I see GiveWell. Maybe actually behind the scene, it's completely different. But that's the way I see it, at least.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty good description. So we look at the constellation of the entire evidence base, and sort of given all these data points, which often point in very different directions, what's our sort of genuine best guess of the effect size of bed nets or whatever? I think of our process as like an informal Bayesian process. Like we don't formally set priors and then update on them based on a likelihood function. But that is essentially what we're doing. Like we'll take a treatment effect and we'll subject it to a bunch of sort of, we call them sideways checks. So we'll look at whether the results replicated. We'll look at do the mechanisms make sense? Like, does the results seem common sense based on what we know about epidemiology, things like that. And I think that is the most robust way to make decisions about how to spend resources. It's sort of not to put 100% weight on any one piece of data or any one point of view, and just try and triangulate and gut check your assumptions as much as you can.
Yeah, I guess, one clarification we said that, for people who are not necessarily familiar with all the studies we've looked at and the response rate was really low, some people did respond. And these studies we've looked at are part of big meta-literatures. I mean, there's big meta-analysis that sum up hey, there's actually 15 studies on that specific topic. So you don't necessarily need the 15 studies, the authors to respond to you and give you the data. Some of these studies, actually, you could get your hand on the data, and even without data, people need to realize we're not talking about there's one study back in 1984 that showed that if you do this, this happens. So the evidence is much richer than this. So I don't know if some of the emails I received once we released this blog post and some posts on social media was a bit of that. It's what? We're making hundreds of millions of dollars donation based on one study from the where there's no data in codes. It's no, wait, it's more complicated than this, and there's way more evidence than it looks like.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think for all the programs we looked at, there's multiple RCTs, most of which find positive effects. So there's reasonable consistency in the direction. I think what this goes back to is that for our decision making, the sort of margins really matter. It really matters to us whether it's a 30% effect or a 20% effect, because if that's the case, then maybe we should be allocating resources, just trying to shift resources around in our portfolio to sort of equalize the margin.
Can you go more in depth about this? Because I think people in academia are obsessed about statistical significance. And I think people completely miss the point that actually effect sizes truly matters, I would say, even more. And I think in development economics, people sometimes, you see some effect sizes of some small scale RCTs. It's that's impossible. If you would have the same thing done by the government, you think about external validity, just equilibrium, general equilibrium effect. That's never going to happen. So how do you deal with this when you see effect sizes? They seem really large. Then you're going to put different points or importance on a specific study because the effect size is much larger, you're going to recommend more. Potentially the cost benefit then completely shifts, right? The formula shifts, and then that's how you're going to change or make different recommendations.
Yeah, no, I can give an anecdote about this actually. I was at a water and sanitation academic conference a few months ago, and GiveWell is exploring funding a new randomized trial at the moment into the effect of water chlorination on infant mortality. And the person I was speaking to was like, "Oh, why are you doing that? Like, we know chlorination saves lives," and I think I'm pretty confident that's true. But it just matters a great deal about whether it saves 30% or it prevents 30% of infant deaths, or whether it prevents 5% of infant deaths. Because if it's the former, then if we, I don't know, donate $10 million to a water chlorination charity, we'd be saving 6 times as many lives than if we're in the world of the latter. And if you're a funder that's trying to make the most of the limited resources, then ideally what you want to do is equalize marginal impact across your different grant making silos. So we think, the impact of our malaria portfolio on the margin is about as impactful as our vaccines portfolio. And so the actual, what you assume about the actual effect size really matters. In terms of how we aggregate a disparate evidence base, it is, I'd say, more art than science. It involves digging into the studies individually and just seeing what their merits are. So in some cases, we have an evidence base which looks, sort of all the studies point roughly in the same direction. So seasonal malaria chemoprevention is an example of that. That's generally easier to deal with. There are other evidence bases like vitamin A supplementation, where the effect sizes are much more scattered. There are some trials which show massive effects, like sort of 30-40% reduction in mortality, and there are some null, like 0 effects. You can read on our website how we arrive at our best guess, which is sort of somewhere in between, about 6-7%. But it involved digging into like the individual studies individually, seeing kind of what their merits were, what the sample size was, whether we thought the randomization strategy made sense, whether we thought they were more externally generalizable to our programs today, depending on where and when they took place. So it's challenging, and we're trying to constantly get better at it and make more transparent the judgment calls we're making, because it's very subjective, I think. But I think reasonable people can come to different opinions about how much weight to put on different studies.
Adam, I love that you called the investments you do your portfolio, right? Because in a sense, what it brings to mind is like portfolio theory, right? Like the sense of volatility of an investment and how risky it is. So I was wondering, looking ahead, do you see reproduction and the infrastructure around it as a way to reduce this volatility? I'm talking like a finance guy. Like, if I was gonna do an investment, is this a way to reduce that volatility going into the future? And if it is, how do you see this going forward? Are you thinking like, damn, it's worth investing in this because it helps us target better? Like, what type of infrastructure do you think should be in place, especially for a place like GiveWell or other founders? How do you see the overall picture in the future?
Yeah, so I think that's the right way of thinking about it. I think if you try and maximize your impact over a sort of 10-year time horizon, then it makes sense to sort of devote some of your resources into reducing uncertainty and just improving your knowledge about the world. One example that we're looking at there is cause of death estimates. So what are children dying from in places like Nigeria? It's easy to take that question for granted, but in places where lots of deaths occur outside of hospitals, it's hard to know. So we're thinking of funding sort of more primary data collection in that space. I would put replication work in that bucket as well. So if we can fund good grants in that space, that could make us more confident in these effect sizes, which could just improve our allocation decisions. That's sort of an active conversation we're having at GiveWell at the moment. So historically, the replication work we funded have just been, purely focused on studies that are relevant to our work. So long run effects of measles vaccination, for example. One thing we're considering is, are there ways GiveWell can play a more meaningful role in the space in general? One example of that is just improving our own protocols for what type of research, what we sort of demand of researchers when we fund trials and things like that. But we would be open to other opportunities as well. Like if it would be possible to, I don't know exactly what this would look like, but if it would be possible to support an effort like I4R, but focus on the medical literature, I think we'd be interested in that if the downstream effect was effect sizes we feel more confident in.
Yeah, we started doing a bit of that with large-scale RCTs. So people, when they apply for funding, they put in their funding proposal, for instance, that as soon as the RCT is done, I4 would need to stamp it and basically saying the data and codes are publicly available. It seems to be robust. Someone at I4 team actually wrote the report, etc. So we had a couple of requests like this. I don't think it's complicated. Usually we do reproductions like this, long reports for something like $5,000 US. If you put this in stark contrast to like the $50 million RCT large scale that they're trying to do, it's peanuts. Like, it's really a very small amount of money. And I mean, it's 2025. Let's just do it. Like, it's not that complicated. I think posting your data online and your codes, if you're going to do something like that costs more than $1 million, should be compulsory. The costs are so big.
I mean, I agree with you. I'm trying to think. So this week I've been speaking to other funders like the Gates Foundation at the World Bank, like just to see. I think there probably are edge cases where like there are ethical or legal reasons where you can't share data, like even if it's anonymized. So we're trying to figure out sort of where that boundary lies. But no, I agree. I think the strong default should be towards open publication. I think other funders have there are interesting efforts being done in this space. So World Bank, I think all the papers being published that are coming out of their DIME research group, those 50%. Have to 50%. Okay.
Yeah, I gave a talk last week, and they're doing amazing. It's truly impressive. They're doing better than most journals that have a data editor. The process it's tremendous.
I was super enthusiastic about their work. And I know Gates, for example, like they have a policy which insists that trials they fund, for example, that the data from those trials have to be uploaded to a public repository, like Vibly or something. So those are the type of things we're looking at as well.
I mean, one thing you just mentioned is some of the data is very sensitive, incredibly sensitive. Yeah. Like we're talking like medical health records, things like this. I actually think replicators play a crucial role in this. And like 6 months ago, I would not have talked about this at all. But now every other week, it happened like 5 minutes before this call. Like
we were talking about this
when you jump in on the call. There's PII and tons of replication packages in development economics. It happened again. We have an event today in San Francisco, Replication Games, and a team just opened a replication package. It's like, it's full of names. And sometimes there's criminal records, medical records, social insurance numbers,
houses addresses,
the whole package, the whole 9 yards. And you're thinking, if these authors, before posting actually their data and codes, would have had someone reproducing it, and I'm not talking about like a complicated reproduction, I'm talking about something really basic. Just have a human going over the data, opening the files and just checking there's no names or PI. It's not complicated. We would save a tremendous amount of, I don't even know how to value this. It's not dollars. It's like, it's crazy, Adam. Every other week, I email editors at top journals saying, here we go again, another like package full of personal information. You need to take this down as soon as possible. And I feel bad for the authors, honestly, sometimes, because, well, I feel bad. It's one way to put it. I mean, they should have looked at their replication packages. But I feel bad for them because often they didn't really touch the data or the codes, and they had like
they didn't prepare the data.
And it's just like, reproduce this. Just like have someone reproducing your work. It's not complicated. Someone outside your team. And before you press like make this public, have someone checking at it. Like it should be like almost compulsory when it's hand collected data. I see it as part of the replication enterprise, to be honest. Checking PII. Yeah. Now we tell people like teams, check PII immediately before actually starting a full replication.
That's super interesting. I actually saw your Twitter thread about this a couple of weeks ago, and that surprised me. I agree. That seems like terrible, and I agree that's an additional role of replication. It does frustrate me a bit when privacy concerns are sort of used as a reason not to publish data. Like I think when I've spoken to other people, I think people have said that's sort of often used as a catch-all, not excuse, but reason we can't publish data. For that to coexist at the same time with all this PII just sort of existing out there in data sets, it just feels that's like the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, completely agree. Especially because sometimes what happens is that this data is from the most vulnerable members of society. Chances are the data leak is not happening in the US. Chances are it's happening in Colombia and India. in somewhere in Africa. So it adds an additional layer of how messed up it is. Like, we're going there and releasing information from some of the most vulnerable members of society. Like, I don't know, it rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, but it's used as an excuse.
For sure.
And I think, unfortunately, it's a valid excuse for not sharing data and codes, because we do CPI all the time, even at journals that have a data editor. So there's really seems to be a big problem with PII. So I do sympathize with people who say, look, I mean, sharing data and codes it's fantastic in theory. In practice, I don't think right now it's done properly. There's a lot of data. You would talk to data editors, they would tell you there's a lot of data out there that if they don't exist, if they don't check, would get public that shouldn't be, not because of PII, but just you don't have the rights to this data. Like, you downloaded this data somewhere, you cannot just post it. Like, it's not. So I think there's a lot of education and learning that needs to be done, that researchers are more aware that you cannot scrape everything on the web and just post it. That's not, you need to write the redefined prints and things like this. It's an interesting time to be alive, I guess, in terms of reproduction and conflicts with PII and other things. But it is, I think, unfortunately, it is a valid excuse. But I think actually replication is the way to go. Before you post, you should have like people having a look at your data and code, just making sure that you haven't released any data or information you're not supposed to.
Agree. Adam, any last remarks? I think we are at time, but we have time for one more comment.
This is just a final question back to you guys, but how difficult is it to anonymize data? Like, my naive take is it should mostly be a case of just dropping sensitive variables. So I'm curious as to why you think that isn't happening in the cases where you discover PII.
I have no idea.
We have our own answers, but if you ask me, I would say it's pure sloppiness. Like, if you want to run the anonymized data and you're aware of it, you can certainly do it. There's no excuse to post criminal records. There's no excuse to post, I don't know, people addresses, you know?
I mean, we're talking about, like, you know, this person lives there. Here's the social insurance number of that person. And by the way, this person has cancer, diabetes. Here's the medication that person, like, it's crazy. And we see this all the time. And to me, it's more than sloppiness. I think it's a culture in development economics and in many disciplines that your research assistants are not co-authors. If the research assistant would be a co-author, that person would follow through, would be more part of the process. You would have real conversation with the person, not just like emails, do this, don't care, here's a comment from referee, just deal with this. I think this delegation to research assistant who do all the work, the lead work and so on, I think it's really bad. I think as soon as you actually bring people into your team, and if they handle sensitive data, they need to do the IRB training. They have to. They're part of the team. They're part of the let's apply for funding. They're part of. I feel like social sciences, public health, to some extent, we lag behind these big labs where there's a lot of training. There's a lot of stuff going on before you can actually touch data and talk to a patient. Here we don't treat people as patient. We treat them as some people answer some question. I just merge data. No, it's a patient. If you have criminal records and you have medical records, you're talking about like vulnerable population. You have done like, but no, these RAs are like MIT PhD student or whatever, or undergrads at Cornell, or just like code this stuff. I don't care. And then the authors never actually look at the data and codes. They genuinely have never looked at it. And then when we point out coding errors at them, most of the time it's like, I'm going to need months because my RA is gone. So now I need to hire a new RA who's never seen this data and codes. Can you share your replicators' codes and data to see like what's going on? I'm like, sure, no problem. But, you know what I mean?
There's definitely a culture that needs to change. Like when you mentioned that sometimes it's the fault of the authors because they don't ask the RAs for the data itself. I think it goes beyond that. Like if you really think about it, and the RA shouldn't even be handling this on their personal GitHubs. Sometimes that we've seen is, yeah, I don't have the data. Let me ask my RA for the GitHub link, and they send us the personal GitHub of the RA with very sensitive data. Like the RA shouldn't even have this. That they should be deleting the data after they work with it. It's like a standard procedure in so many disciplines. How are we struggling with this in 2025? But it's a rant for another day.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I don't know, super pleased that you guys are banging the drum. I'll sneak in one final question to you guys. So GiveWell is as I've described, a foundation in global health. We're interested in maximizing the impact, but also potentially reducing uncertainty around some of these treatment effects. What role do you think we can play in the broader ecosystem in encouraging the sharing of more open access norms?
I think Abel is way more prepared to answer that question. But if you ask me, I would jump into your bandwagon, what you say earlier about the demand and asking stuff when you in the contracts and in the grants like that, because you generate the demand. But I'm sure Abel has a way more complete answer.
No, I mean, that's the first part for sure. I think it's blog posts and what you ask us to do as well. I think a lot of people had actually no idea that data sharing was not a thing before like 2005, 2010 in most disciplines. It's just lack of training, lack of understanding what reproducibility is. Like when you talk to people at the World Bank and top people in development economics, like usually they're aware of this. They're aware that most replication packages don't run the first time you look at them. It's something like 15-20% that actually do fully run, and they're trying to do something about it. Like we can criticize public health and development economics all we want, but actually those are the fields usually that are ahead of the curves in trying to fix some of these problems. I think what GiveWell is doing is fantastic. I think just keep promoting data sharing. What Juan just said, what you said earlier, if you're going to give funding to a bunch of researchers, just ask them, well, one condition is you do share your data in codes, or that you find someone, doesn't matter who it is, that's going to externally reproduce your work. And there's plenty, like we're not the only one. There's other institutes that do this, that just run your codes for a small cost, sometimes even free. It's really not that complicated. I think people are really just scared of sharing their data in codes because of mistakes. And I feel like, well, yeah, do it before it's published, before it goes public. If you want to get embarrassed, at least do it privately. Don't do it publicly when it's too late. And I think a lot of it happens, unfortunately, after publication. So we do most of the work that we do after publication, but you could imagine a world where most of this actually happens before publication. So I would say just keep doing whatever you're doing. I think it's fantastic what GiveWell is doing. And you're asking the questions. That's more than what's happening at most foundations. These conversations are just not even happening. So we're always happy to help GiveWell, Open Phil. Whenever you need something, or if there are studies you want us to replicate, we're always happy to do it.
And I wanted to add something, which is something we discussed before. I think a big part of it, it's making so that the founders or the people who give money care about this stuff. If we manage to break the culture of, I'm just giving away money, that's it. See you 20 years down the road. If we make people care about this stuff, it eventually trickles down into the researchers themselves. So I think it's both ways. The journals, it's a whole ecosystem. Yeah. But the founders or the people who give away money they have like a great power, and with great power comes great responsibility.
That's a nice turn to end on.
Yes, let's stop here. Thanks, Adam. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam.
No, thank you guys. Yeah, that was fun.